mode.
Hello and welcome. Thank you for coming to today's Atticus Advantage webinar, the 10 ways to improve your initial consultation. My name is Mike Wells and I'm the organizer of today's event. Before we begin, I'd like to just go over a little bit of information about Atticus. If you're not familiar with us, Atticus was founded in 1989 to provide in-depth, ongoing support and accountability programs for attorneys and law firms that effectively help you increase your gross income and your personal income and your gross revenues for your firm, reduce the stress and the number of hours you spend at the office, have a greater sense of career satisfaction, and most importantly, allow you more time for family and personal interests. Our programs, workshops, and webinars are designed to streamline the management of your practice, increase your revenue, reduce stress, and balance your personal and professional life. If you have a question during today's session, there are a couple of ways you can do that. You can use the chat function on your GoToWebinar dashboard to send the message to the event organizer, that's me. If you'd like that question to remain anonymous, please indicate so in your message. The second method is you can click the hand icon to indicate you have a question or comment, and we'll call on you at the end of the session. And when we do, we'll unmute you so that you can be heard by everyone. Today's presentation is being led by Steve Riley. Steve is an attorney and practice advisor with Atticus. He has a way of helping you get unstuck and guide you through a process of self-discovery and major breakthroughs. He is an author of several books and leads many of our programs and has created many of our workshops, including the W Revenue Workshop, the Practice Growth Program, and the Dominate Your Market Program. Thank you, Steve, for leading today's presentation. This is a great topic, and I know the audience will get a great deal out of it.
Thanks, Mike. Thanks. And welcome, everybody. Welcome. I know that we have a lot of people attending today's webinar, and this is also one of my favorite topics to discuss. I love to talk about the initial consultation, regardless of your practice area. I think it's probably one of the more fascinating improvement points in most practices. And most lawyers, when they look at their initial consultation, have pretty much been doing their initial consultation the same way for years because it worked. You know, it's working, therefore the ability to innovate, think differently about it, it's usually not something that I see a lot of lawyers think about. So as we look about, as we start to work through the top 10 ways to improve, and these are, we probably could do 100 different ways to improve consultations. I've studied them. I've taught about different ways of doing consultations. I've taught lawyers how to teach non-lawyers how to do initial consultation. So there's a lot of really interesting dynamics that can go on through the initial consultation and really improve the experience for the customer. Because one of the things lawyers fail to realize, unless you're in the contingency fee side of the business, and even then I think there's some arguments on this, if you're looking for a way of increasing your referrals, increasing your prices, and increasing the satisfaction of the people that referred the prospect into you, there's nowhere better to start that process than how you currently operate or your team operates the initial meeting with a prospective client. So my experience has been, I haven't yet met anyone that we couldn't help them look at their initial consultation in a different perspective. Now, as we look at this, I just want to set a perspective around this. So we're big fans, obviously we're in the solo and small firm market and niche. We work with lawyers across the country in solo and small firms, and some in Canada. So for our friends in Canada, of course, we wouldn't exclude you. And really, when we look at this, your legal skills basically are the foundations of your practice. So if you're following along on the screen right now, there's a really interesting graphic. If you can scoot over from looking at emails or whatever you're doing right now, just look at this graphic for a moment. Because the foundation of your practice is your legal skills. Interestingly enough, and doing this for long enough, we have learned that the 4 things that probably impact your revenue, your gross revenue, your personal income, control of your time, your personal freedom, and the impact of the community are 4 core business skills. One is your ability to manage your time and focus your time. And part of that is impacted through the initial consultation. I see a lot of lawyers do very, very long initial consultations, and it's usually because they don't know what they're doing in them. They're just a little out of control. They haven't thought through them. They're not very focused. Two, client development marketing. If you're looking at trying to grow your practice, the ability to understand your skills from a client development and marketing perspective is absolutely crucial. And building a great team. This is the blind spot for most lawyers. When their practices get somewhere between $500,000 to $600,000 in gross revenue, they'll start to cap out in growth because the blind spot that they don't see is their ability to find, hire, manage, and train great people. And then cash flow and profitability. Nothing will impact the growth of your firm like these 4 business skills. So as we work through the 10 ways of improving your initial consultation, you're going to see variations of these business skills flowing in and out. So I don't care what your legal skill is. I'm going to assume that you're good at whatever you do. Otherwise, you wouldn't be on this call. You would not be in a position to look for help in growing your practice. I'm just going to assume you're good at whatever you do as a lawyer. Really, what we're going to focus on is how to improve your skills as a business person in growing your practice, in particular in this one very small area. So my agenda is pretty straightforward. Why? Why is the initial consultation so critical? 2, I want to spend a few minutes talking about prospect mindsets and what are the mindsets that prospects have and go through. We're going to hit 10 ways to improve your initial consultation. And then, of course, for our bonus points, we'll spend a few minutes at the end for bonus points for everything from questions or other things that may not have been covered or things that I'd like to throw in that probably didn't make the top 10 list. So why? Why is it so important? Why is your initial consultation so critical? Before I dive into that, I just want to have you ask yourself the following question. If we are to improve your initial consultation today, what would you change about it? So just write this out on a scrap piece of paper, write it down. Just write whatever that improvement idea might be. Because there's some things about it that you know right now that could be improved. It could be it's too long. It could be that you're disorganized. It could be that you're meeting with unqualified people. It could be that you don't know who you're meeting with prior to them coming in. It could be that you have very little information from them before they come in. It could be that you don't want to be doing them. You'd rather have a non-lawyer do them. There's a lot of things that you can improve. Just write it out right now so you can kind of get focused on it. Now, as you write that out and start to think about it, the why for me is that everything around the customer expectation from prospect to customer occurs during this magic meeting called the initial meeting. And there are so many different ways that you can mess up the customer service experience by setting the wrong expectations or not setting the proper expectations about how you can help people solve their problems, whatever those problems might be. And some lawyers are people pleasers, and consequently they overpromise and underdeliver. And some people are very careful, so they don't promise enough, and then think that people will be delighted if they underpromise and overdeliver. My experience is the entire expectation of the relationship is going to be defined in this meeting. Everything from how you're going to provide services to promises around pricing. So everything is defined here. So your consultation really sets the tone of the relationship, whether it's you or a non-lawyer doing it. So if you start to look at this, I just want you to start thinking about, man, as I process through my brain, all the different ways that my initial consultation causes a collateral expectation ripple throughout my practice. So everything that you set as far as an expectation during the initial needs to be delivered on during the whole value chain of the relationship with the client. So as we do this, start thinking in your mind, where can I change it? How can I improve it? Now, as we start to dive in this, these are some of the key elements that I think you need to consider. And one distinction is that these people are prospects until they hire you. They're not clients, they are prospects. So one of the things that lawyers sometimes get goofy about is not appreciating the ethical ramifications of giving legal advice to a prospect, if they are a prospect. So one of the things you have to balance inside an initial meeting is how much advice is it appropriate to give to a prospect, because once you give advice to a prospect, in most jurisdictions, ethically, they're now going to be a client. And it's important to understand, because when you're looking at this from the prospect's perspective, they're really wrestling with typically three things. Number one is their trust in you. Like, what's their trust level? If they get referred in by a high value referral source, their trust level may be through the roof. But if they come in off of Avo or off the internet, off of some form of online advertising, their trust level may be low. Two is, what's their education level? And I don't mean education like academically, are they a doctor or do they have a PhD? What I mean is, what's their level of education about the problem they're coming in to see you about? The more sophisticated you are as an attorney, usually the less sophisticated the client is. Meaning, let me rephrase that. That's not a great way of saying that. Let me try it differently. Usually the more hyper-specialized you are, usually the further away the client is from understanding how you work and how you solve the problem. So if you do offshore tax planning, having somebody come in and see you and say, yeah, I think I need a will show you the incredible gap and the education process between where you're at and where they're at in their education about what it is they need. So part of the problem in thinking through your initial consultation is understanding that the client is not educated enough, the prospect is not educated enough to know enough about the problem, to think well enough about the problem, to ask you good questions. So one of the things that will really improve your initial consultation is thinking through what are some of the ways that you can pre-educate a prospect. Could that be by webinar? Could that be by audio? Could that be by YouTube videos? Could that be by educational booklets and white papers, or a book that you've written? What can you do to pre-educate the person so that a lot of that education about their issue, the basic education, is resolved prior to the initial meeting? And then next is value versus cost consciousness. Do they perceive the services that you provide to be valuable, or do they perceive this as a cost? So when you're dealing with a prospect, they're wrestling with all three of these issues at any given time. First and foremost, do they trust you or your firm? Two, what's their education level about? Do they understand what you do and how you do it? And what's their value versus cost? Is this the first time they work with a lawyer, or is it an institutional client that deals with lawyers all the time? So understanding the prospect's mindset really can impact how you set up and maximize the experience of initial consultation. In addition to that, the mindset will be affected by the origin source of the prospect. Like I said earlier, if they're referred in by a past client, they may come in with a very, very, very high level of trust, but could also be a low level of education, because they said, look, go see Steve. He's terrific. He's the best in town. And then the person may come in but have no education about what it is I actually do, other than I got this high referral. Their cost versus value consciousness might be higher because they got such a strong referral. Now compare that to someone that sees my profile on Avo, or sees something on Facebook. They may come in with a lower level of trust, perhaps a higher level of education because they're out there reading things on the internet, and their cost consciousness might be very, very intense. They might be more concerned about price than expertise, versus someone who got referred in by another lawyer or a financial planner or a CPA or a doctor, a professional colleague. So appreciating where your prospect comes in from is absolutely critical in thinking through how do you impact the three variables of trust, education, value versus cost consciousness. So when you start to look at your initial, I want you to really take in consideration that the potential prospect perhaps will be radically influenced during the initial by where they came from. Past client, some form of advertising, whether it's TV or internet advertising, or a professional colleague. All these different places can absolutely impact the mindset of the prospect and can totally influence how your initial consultation is going to work. In some firms that our company works with, I usually make them lay out what I call a prospect pipeline. I may have a different pipeline for educating and getting a prospect ready for an initial meeting. It might be different if they're referred in by a past client. Will absolutely be different if they come off the internet. And it may be completely different if they got referred in by a professional colleague. So all three of these different pipelines may shift based on where the prospect comes from. Now, this, of course, depends on the size of your practice. If you're a solo practitioner, no support staff, it's going to be hard to really think this through and set it up unless you're hyper specialized. If you've got a couple of support staff, you're decent at marketing, I really think you're probably at the point in time that you need to start thinking through what are the different prospect pipelines and how are they impacted. Now, of course, that's something I'm going to recommend that if you are looking at doing, you probably want to work through that in one of our group programs, something like the Practice Growth Program, or work with one of our practice advisors. Probably the best way to get started with that is do a Practice Growth Diagnostic, which will be one of the things I talk about towards the end. Or, I think we'll have Jeff or Larry reach out to you at the end of the webinar to really encourage you to start thinking about how you can make some of the changes that we're going to recommend in this webinar. With that said, clarity. What's the point of your initial? You got to really think about, what am I trying to do here? You got to get really clear on your message and what you're selling, what you're asking the prospect to do. My experience is sometimes on the transaction side of the business, usually the lawyer is selling a next step, or sometimes lawyers immediately going into diagnostic mode and start doing the work. You got to start taking a step back and saying, okay, in my process, really, what's the point of my initial? Is it to get hired? Is it to pre-educate the prospect? What am I trying to do in the initial? Because really what you're trying to wrestle with is getting the prospect to communicate to you so you can discover their expectations, allow you to set or reset expectations, especially if you're in the consumer market. If you're dealing with someone who's never dealt with a lawyer before, they have different expectations. And most of those expectations are set by TV, movies, and media, or books they've read. So the ability to think through how you can discover what their expectations are, what you're going to do, set the expectations of how you're going to deliver services, and reset any expectations is absolutely critical, because that's where a lot of the clarity is going to come from. In my experience is where most lawyers get in trouble on customer service issues that typically end up in bar grievances is clarity around expectations. So for something as simple as how quickly do you respond to email? Do they have access to your cell phone to text you questions? Do you return phone calls over the weekends? Everything from simple expectations such as emails and return phone calls to outcomes on cases, or what to expect in a process, are absolute critical expectations to look at what they have in their mind, discover, what you say is going to work, set, and then expect them to perhaps have, especially in today's day and age, have a instantaneous expectation around your response via email, phone calls, and social media. So you may have to reset expectations. For example, if you're a trial lawyer, you may say, look, while I'm in trial, I'll be trying a case for a week, and I'm going to be totally focused on that case. I will not be returning emails, and probably won't be returning phone calls. But my paralegal or the case manager, whoever it is handling your case or working with me on your case, will. So thinking this through is pretty critical. Great. With that said, let's start digging into the 10 ways that I'd like to focus on. Now, in all of the initial consultations I've studied and worked with other lawyers on, and there have been quite a few, They're typically what I consider the 5 P's of initial consultation. And those of you that are following along the screen, I have them up on the screen right now. But number 1 is being present. And what I mean by that is I want you engaged intellectually and emotionally in the conversation with your prospect. If you're one of the lawyers that writes a note, asks a question, then puts your head down and writes a note on a yellow pad, I'm going to encourage you not to do that. I'm going to encourage you instead to have an assistant or a paralegal or a better intake process there so you can get emotionally and intellectually engaged with your prospect. I think it's probably one of the biggest things to save time and really develop fast rapport is to actually be there face-to-face, eyeball to eyeball, and not be distracted by trying to take a whole bunch of notes. Have somebody there with you to do that if you can do that in your practice. 2, permission. One of the most important things that I can teach you or share with you as a fellow brother of the bar, so to speak, is to develop ways of asking the prospects permission to move forward in conversation. One of the most powerful questions I've ever learned is the following: do I have your permission to ask you difficult questions? Now, I love that question because it saves me a lot of time. I've walked into meetings where my colleagues or competitors may be spending 3-hour meetings with someone on an initial meeting, and I can walk in and ask that question and get right to the heart of what's going on, get engaged, and walk out the door in 30 minutes to maybe an hour, depending on the facts of the situation, because they gave me permission to go right to the heart and soul of it. Some lawyers will spend a lot of time trying to develop rapport, which I don't think is necessary if you can ask for permission. And if they trust you, and this is your first real test of trust, is if they give you permission, they're saying, I trust you. 3, problem. What's the problem from their perspective? Now, as a lawyer, you're going to see the problem from your perspective. The analogy I would use if somebody comes in and goes, yeah, I think I have heart problems, my chest hurts, and they're talking to a doctor, the doctor may see it as being a pulmonary issue, not a cardiology issue. So they may be seeing it as a different issue depending on what problems the client presents. But you want to hear it from the client's perspective. Most of the time, we're critiqued as lawyers for 2 reasons in customer service surveys. Number 1, not returning phone calls promptly, going back to expectations. And number 2, for not being good listeners. Because we're fast conceptual learners, consequently, when somebody starts asking a question 9 times out of 10, we're already answering it without listening fully to the question. And consequently, we're not hearing the problem completely from their perspective. Number 4, process. What is your process to solve the prospect's problem? Now, some of you as litigators will have a court process that you'll have to explain, whether that's family law or PI or criminal or whatever litigation process that you may have to shepherd somebody through, but they've never seen it before. They don't know what that is. So explaining the process, and here's where I really like flow charts. So for those of you who are following along and taking notes, I would recommend that if you have a process that you're shepherding someone through, a visual flow chart is going to be far more influential than you verbally speaking. You're just speaking about it and droning on about it. As lawyers, we're trained to communicate 2 ways, verbally and in writing. The challenge with this is 76% of the population processes information visually. So if you are in the consumer market where you're dealing not with institutions, but, good old-fashioned, mom and pop consumers, the process flow charts in an initial meeting will save you so much time and will make the experience so much easier for them. And then price. If you're in a non-contingency practice, pricing and explaining your prices is absolutely crucial. If you're in contingency practice, you still have to explain how you're getting paid and what that will possibly be. So, I spent a good decade of my life doing contingency fee work, so I can appreciate the enthusiasm of a client saying, yes, I'm totally fine giving you a percentage of the case now until you actually collect the check, and then they say, well, I didn't realize a percentage would be that percentage. So making sure that you understand these 5 Ps, I think, are probably the most crucial elements in designing and thinking through the architecture or the context of your initial consultation, if you will. Number 2, be prepared. What key things should you have ready? Well, the 2 basic things that I see lawyers leaving out all the time from their initial meetings is an engagement letter. Now, this is easily, solved in some cases not so much, but I really think that if you have to have a handwritten, or I should say an engagement letter that you fill in by hand on some of the key elements, I think you need to have one. And credit card authorization. It's still surprising to me how many lawyers don't take credit cards. And the bulk of your consumers like to pay by credit card. So, I would encourage you to get a credit card authorization form or whatever credit card authorization process you need in your initial meeting, so that there's no time being wasted. I would work with the assumption that they're going to hire you. Now, this is funny because a lot of lawyers work with the assumption that they're not going to get hired. I just want to encourage you that the prospect is giving you a buying signal. The buying signal is pretty obvious. They're there. They're in the room with you. That's typically a pretty strong, we're interested in buying something from you signal. So I would really encourage you to say, okay, what do I have to have in my meeting? What do I have to do to be prepared? What do I have to do to make this easier for the prospect? 3, using stories effectively and consistently. Anyone that's been through any of my workshops or any of the programs will typically appreciate the fact that I am a nut around stories. I love the use of stories in talking to prospects. And if you are in any type of practice where you have to communicate to consumers, the use of stories is absolutely crucial. Those of you that are trial lawyers, those of you who are doing jury trials, the value of a great story cannot be understated. But consequently, I think as lawyers, we typically don't pay attention to using stories effectively and consistently in the initial meeting. So if you don't think you're using stories, I would ask you to have an assistant or law clerk or paralegal or somebody sit in your initial meeting with you and write down every story you say or write down every example you use. For me, when I switched from trial work to estate planning, the centerpiece story that we used in explaining a revocable trust was called instead of calling a trust a living trust, we called it a bucket. We talked about the difference between closed-lid trust and open-lid trust, meaning revocable and irrevocable trust, by using a bucket as an example. Saves so much time. So I'm just going to encourage you to look at where you're using stories, ask if you're using the stories effectively and consistently, and start to work on a story glossary. And a story glossary is pretty straightforward. You want to talk about what the story is, the point of the story, and when to use the story. And that's really, I'm not going to spend much more time on that. I probably do one-day training programs just on using stories effectively in your firm, but that's all we're going to do today. Otherwise, I will be seduced to talk more and more about story marketing and story selling. Great. 4, use visuals of any kind. Look, if you are one of those lawyers that like to communicate by drawing on a legal pad, I'm going to encourage you to upgrade to a smart board, Apple TV, any form of electronic board that allows you to diagram on the board in a way that allows you to capture what you draw, because more than likely you're drawing the same thing over and over and over. Look for ways of institutionalizing those visual processes. If you want to use if there's pictures or diagrams that you use, I'm going to encourage you to draw them out. If you have to, get a graphic artist to capture them. And graphic artists do this all the time, either hourly or by a fixed price, to help you really, do a great job diagramming some element of your practice, or some element of your process inside your practice. So anytime you can get a visual, any visual that makes it easier for the prospect to understand, it is going to be worth its weight in gold. Great, next one. An agenda. It is amazing to me how something as simple as an agenda for an initial consultation can make a significant difference. So I'm going to encourage you, if you don't have an agenda, to create an agenda. So if Larry or Jeff call you and they ask, hey, Steve wanted me to call you and say, what's one of the things that you're going to improve in your initial consultation? And you don't have an agenda, tell them, I'm going to take Steve's advice and create an agenda. And nothing can reset or help you control the expectations of a meeting with a prospect than a preset agenda. And it's pretty powerful if you can structure it so all the important questions are up front. All the tough questions are up front. And this is where my permission from point number one comes from. If you can build in your tough questions up front, it can make a significant impact on the caliber of that meeting. So I'm just going to encourage you to look at the agenda. It doesn't have to be massive. I've seen initial meeting agendas being 1 page, sometimes 2 pages. I typically recommend that you share the agenda with the prospect, saying this is the agenda for the meeting, and then ask them if there's anything they'd like to see added to the agenda, and then explain to them how long an initial meeting typically takes, and then go for it. That typically can really change the dynamic of a meeting very, very powerfully. And it looks very professional. They look at it and they go, wow, they know what they're doing. They've got an agenda. So versus a lawyer that walks in and does the traditional show up or throw up, which is walk in with a yellow pad and a pen and just start babbling. It raises the professionalism of the initial meeting up tremendously. So I only can encourage you to go for it. Number 6, pricing. So if you're an hourly rate shop or a fixed price shop, I really would like to see you going for your discussion around pricing about midway through the initial meeting. I really think that somewhere between 50 to 60% of the way in, you should be at a point that you can start talking about pricing and process and what you charge to help them solve whatever problems they're confronted with. Absolutely, if you're charging by the hour or fixed prices, I'm going to strongly recommend that you have an engagement letter to clarify what those fees cover. My experience is to this day, still I'm amazed at how many lawyers aren't using engagement letters explaining how they charge and what they charge for. And if you're a fixed price shop, and what I mean by that, if you just charge fixed prices for your services, I'm going to recommend that you have a price list like you would have at a menu in a restaurant. I think this is a basic must-have. So if you don't have a price list and you are doing fixed prices, that might be the thing that you tell Larry and Jeff when they call and say, I'm going with the price list. Steve said to do a price list. I don't have a price list. I'm going to push off the agenda. I'm going to do a price list because that will make a huge impact on my practice. My experience is the lawyers that start using price lists on the fixed price side of the fixed priced side, they typically will see their fees increase 30% to 60% because they're not discounting. So let's talk about that just for a brief moment. Probably the 2 biggest challenges that we see over and over and over with lawyers is most lawyers don't have a pricing philosophy. What most lawyers do when they go into an initial meeting, if they don't have a price list or a set pricing philosophy, is that they basically do mood pricing. They walk in, they check out the prospect, they figure out where they're at in a month for expenses, maybe tomorrow's payroll, and then they make up a price based on the complexity of what they see in front of them and how they're feeling at that moment. That's just straight up mood pricing or mood billing. Consequently, it's not a big confidence builder to someone because they know you're making it up. They see you making it up. Now, you may be thinking to yourself, yeah, but I'm taking consideration this and that, and blah, 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 and everything that's going on inside your head. It doesn't matter. You're still making it up because it's going on inside your head, and then you're blurting it out to them. They don't see any thought process other than you just blurting it out. So it looks like mood pricing. The other thing that we see happen over and over and over in pricing is discounting. And lawyers sometimes, they get nervous, they get uncomfortable. You know, if they're dealing with someone who's negotiated before, or even somebody sold cars before, the lawyer's going to be typically out negotiated when it comes to their pricing and their fees, because we're not trained. We're trained negotiators legally, but when it comes to setting our own pricing, we're terrible. I always say that we're lions in the courtroom and lambs at the office. So you may be tough advocating for your client in front of the judge, but goodness, when you're sitting down in front of the same client trying to get paid, you turn into a complete wimp. So be careful. Watch out for mood pricing. Don't be a pricing wimp. You know, respect yourself, respect the pricing integrity of your firm, and come up with some form of pricing philosophy that works. Great. Bundle versus unbundle. This really depends on whether you're an hourly rate shop or a fixed price shop. It's typically hard to do in a contingency fee practice, but if we have a complex case or a complex process such as a business closing or commercial real estate closing or complicated Medicaid or elder law planning or estate planning, or even if you're a fixed price divorce firm, you may think ways of unbundling your prices versus one giant fixed price. So the easiest way to think of this is a bundled price is like buying a buffet at a restaurant. One price, everything's included. Unbundling's a la carte, meaning that you can buy different items off the menu separately. On complex cases and complex processes, typically unbundled processes and unbundled pricing work better for the consumer. And they typically work better for the law firm. In unbundled situations, I typically see that the revenue per case is usually 30 to 40% better than the bundled price model. So when you're looking at this, you have to make a determination: am I providing a complex process? Is this a complex case? Am I better off unbundling my pricing and unbundling my services, or is it bundling works better? The reason I talk about this inside the initial consultation is if you're dealing with someone who's got low trust, they're poorly educated, and they're not so certain about the cost versus the value, a small upfront price for the first step of an unbundled process will typically land them versus a high price of a bundled process. So if you're a lawyer that has a complex process, whether it's immigration or estate planning or elder law or business, whatever you have, and you're competing against lawyers that bundled, an unbundled model may actually be more effective in the marketplace because people can understand it better versus a bundled model. So this is a strategy. This is pricing strategy at its best. It's pricing strategy and process strategy. So I'm just kind of spending a few minutes to have you look at this, because some of the more sophisticated practitioners that we work with are moving more and more to unbundled pricing and unbundled process models because they're better for the consumer and also better for the law firm. Some lawyers that are afraid of selling will typically just do a bundled model and argue with, just trust me and pay me all this money and I'll fix this for you. It's really your strategy. It's really your approach. I don't think either one is going to hurt you. I just think understanding the strategy and how each strategy can help you during the initial will only help you. So I don't care which way you go, as long as you think about it and pick one way or the other. My bias is typically going to be towards unbundled because it seems to be anecdotally, in my experience, a far more effective model. Okay, great. So I'm going to stop right there because that one is complicated enough. Number 8, be yourself. I think that you being comfortable in your own skin and being confident about who you are is one of the core elements of a very successful initial meeting. So if you are very comfortable, if you're very comfortable with who you are and how you like to interact with people and how you feel, if you have a sense of humor, use a sense of humor. If you don't. If you are a very serious lawyer and a very serious person, then be very serious. Don't try and force humor and where it doesn't work. I've seen a lot of lawyers that have been trained on doing their initials model their former boss or former mentors, which is great if you're modeling their process, if you're modeling some of their questions, but it may not be great if you're trying to model their personality. So you have to kind of get to a point where you're comfortable being you. And it's interesting to me that there's a lot of lawyers, especially that have been practicing 10 years and under, that really aren't comfortable being themselves in initial meetings. So I just want to encourage you to kind of explore what that looks like. Now, with that said, if you're a very casual person, you like flip-flops and t-shirts and shorts on the weekend, I'm not going to recommend that you show up in an initial meeting in flip-flops, t-shirts, and shorts. I'm going to recommend that you think about what would make a really great impression for your prospecting referral sources and really appreciate where they're coming from when it comes to attire and what your initial meeting room should look like and how you're trying to create a great experience for them. Number 9. Number 9 is to acknowledge where they're at emotionally. In my experience, most of the time, people are coming to see you and they're stressed out. You know, they're really worried about something. It may be a problem. If you might be doing some area of the legal practice that might be considered happy law, like maybe adoptions or you know, some parts of estate planning. I can't think of other areas immediately. Maybe immigration, where you know there's some happiness to it and people are coming to see you happy. Most of the time, we're unfortunately dealing with people at their worst, and they're up against some really difficult situation. And you know, I can only encourage you to find humanity, both for you and your prospects, and appreciate where they're coming from. Acknowledge what their emotional concerns are. And acknowledge them for where they're at emotionally at the beginning, the end of the process, or during the process. More importantly, make them feel right, smart, and that they're at the right place during the initial meeting. So I'm amazed at how many times I've watched lawyers do initial meetings and they focus on the facts of the case. They focus on the law of the case. But they completely ignore the emotional stress of the client and or prospect. So I'll give you an example, and this is an example of my own life, my own practice, and it's one that always has usually shocked people when I explain this, but at one point in my career, I was doing a lot of elder law work, and what that meant was I was dealing with a caregiver who was making decisions for an elderly parent who's in a nursing home. And the caregiver typically was raising children, working a full-time job, and trying to take care of a parent who has dementia or developing dementia or Alzheimer's or some, you know, had a stroke or some terrible thing. And my client, or I should say the person I was interfacing with, the caregiver was really in a tough spot. And I didn't get warm and fuzzy people. I got CEOs as caregivers, yes. I got lawyers as caregivers for their parents, yes. And I got, you know, VPs of major corporations and head of major government agencies. So my client list as caregivers were not warm and fuzzy, you know, people. They were tough, full-time working, and they were all men for some reason. And they would refer, you know, each other. They were terrific referral sources, so they would always refer each other in. But when they came in, you know, these were really successful people, and I learned to acknowledge where they were at emotionally. So typically, I'd say, look, you know, I got it that you're really stressed out about this, and you're trying to make the right call. And while they might have been the head of a litigation department at a large law firm, they're still somebody's son, and they're still somebody's dad, and they're still trying to make the right call for their mom or grandmother. And I would say, your parent chose you because they knew when things got tough, you would be the right person to make the right decision. And you may feel uncomfortable right now, but we do this all the time, and you're at the right place, and you're making the right decisions, and we got your back. Now, those are emotional acknowledgments about what they're worried about and where they're at. It doesn't really address the case per se, but it addresses how they're feeling at that moment. Now, I know there's probably family law lawyers on this call that can run circles around me on dealing with emotional issues in family law cases, but I'm amazed at how many lawyers completely ignore where their prospects are at emotionally in this process. So they might be scared, they might be stressed out, but I just want to spend a few minutes to say, don't run away from this. This is probably, for me, one of the more transformative elements of practicing law that I did not learn from a mentor, a law professor, that's for darn sure, or from a CLE instructor. It was something I learned from being in the trench day after day. And the lawyers that I've shared this with and taught this to, that have gone off and integrated this in their initial meeting, have come back and told me, man, that was incredible, because the emotional connection between me and the client, who's now a client, or the prospect, is so off the charts that they're advocates for the firm. They listen to what I say, and I feel like our relationship has come to a different level. So I just want to encourage you to pay attention to this, look at this, and see if there's a way for you to improve your initial on this. Number 10. And I got a couple bonus points, but I just want to hit number 10 here. Script out the elements if necessary. If you're new to the business and you can't afford to work with Atticus, which we do have some threshold requirements, I'm going to recommend that you script out the elements of your initial meeting if necessary. And if you have to, have somebody practice with you. And then if you're nervous, if you're getting nervous and you haven't closed a lot of business, or if you feel uncomfortable talking about money, then have somebody practice with. If you have to, get someone who's a friend that's been trained in sales and have them listen to you and practice with them. Look, if you're going to go and grow a practice and you're going to be really good at being a lawyer, I'm going to also recommend that you practice just as hard on the business side of the law as you would on any other element of the law. I mean, if I could get a lawyer to spend 10% of their practice time trying to improve their practice rather than just trying to improve their legal skills, it could be a transformative impact. My experience is most lawyers only spend about 2 to 3% of their non-practicing time, meaning non-legal skill time, on trying to improve their practice. The ones that are out there changing the game, the ones that are market dominant players, probably 20 to 50% of their time is focused on building the practice, and only 50% of the time is on the legal side anymore. And those are the ones that are market leaders. Those are the ones that are crushing everybody else. It's because they're focused on the business side of it, less and less on the legal technical side. So this is one of the things that I've seen some of the top players do, is they actually rehearse and practice their initial. They actually rehearse and practice talking about prices. They actually rehearse and practice their close. So these are things that I would only encourage you to try and look at doing. I can't make you do any of this, but I can only encourage you to do this. And, my point here is to be brave about this, try and make these changes, even though they sound a little uncomfortable and a little scary. I'm not trying to say make all 10 changes today. I'm just saying pick 1 or 2. Like I said earlier, if you don't have the agenda, go for the agenda. If you have an agenda but don't have a price list, go to a price list. If you think the price list will have the biggest impact, go with the price list. But I'm going to encourage you to do something to improve your initial, because I haven't seen anywhere else in the practice that can have as much leverage, both financially and emotionally, than the initial meeting. I keep studying this, I keep looking at it, and 3 decades of doing this, I really think the initial meeting is the heart and soul of the expectation experience of the prospect who becomes a client. So just want to encourage you to look at this a little differently, slow down, and really start to study it. Now, with that said, I said earlier that I am going to make a request, and my request is that if you are ready to make a change in your practice or your life, I'm going to recommend that you look at doing a practice growth diagnostic. And if you're not so sure whether it's a good fit for you or not a good fit for you, I'm going to recommend that you take a phone call from my two colleagues, Jeff and Larry. And their pictures are up on the screen, two good-looking guys, super nice guys, two probably nicest guys I've ever met. And they're really there to train, they're really trained to help you move forward with your practice. And they're just going to call with one question. Of the 10 recommendations that we made on ways to change your initial consultation, what's the number one that you're changing? What are you going to do, and how are you going to do it? Now, while they're on the phone with you, I'm going to ask them to recommend to you to also do a practice growth diagnostic, because the webinar today is looking at a couple of very, very light elements of changing your practice and very, very light elements of changing your initial consultation. But if I could get you to spend some time and really focus on your firm's performance, over a period of time, you can become a really strong practitioner, not legally. I'm not worried about your legal skills, just on the business side. And usually that's where we can make the biggest impact inside a practice. And I'm going to recommend that you take on doing a practice growth diagnostic. And the practice growth diagnostic has just some 4 critical elements. The first is to get your DISC done. And your DISC is really looking at how you can think about to use your own DISC profile to your advantage. And I'm not going to spend much time on that today because it's going to be too much time to dig into. When Larry or Jeff calls you, they can talk to you more about the DISC. But I think the DISC is probably the secret sauce for a lot of lawyers. 2 is getting an assessment of where your practice is at. And we are going to put you through the 4 cornerstones of the foundations of practice growth. The coach or client services director that does the call with you will give you some recommendation. And at the end of the call, you're going to talk about the 3 most important and impactful actions that you can take. And I'm going to recommend that you just go for this. It's a small investment, $295, includes your DISC survey, typically takes 1 hour. And the easiest way to get started, quite frankly, is to go to our website, atticusadvantage.com, and click Let's Get Started, where that great big yellow arrow is at. And let's see if there's anything else I want to say about that other than, look, if you've been on one of these webinars more than 2 or 3 times, it is time for you to take the risk and register for a practice growth diagnostic. And here's my promise back to you. The Atticus promise is straight up about this. If you do a practice growth diagnostic and you don't find it valuable, we will refund your money 100%, no questions asked. So I would say go for the diagnostic. Go for it, check it out, see what you can get out of it, see if it can open up the eyes of the business person inside you, the business person that's trying to get out and help you grow the practice, and really see what we can do to move your practice forward to reduce stress and really increase income. And I'm going to encourage you to do it, because the last thing I want to hear from you is you saying, you know, Steve, I've been thinking about it. If you've been on this webinar series more than 2 or 3 times, I'm going to encourage you to do the practice growth diagnostic, because I'm really worried that you're just procrastinating by thinking about it. I understand it's scary, but I can meet you 100% of the way by saying, look, if there's no value to it, don't worry, we'll refund your money, you know, no questions asked. But there is value to it. I'm going to encourage you to talk to whoever does a diagnostic and talk about what we can do to help you and support you in the growth of your practice. I don't want to just leave you here hanging out, because thinking about anything like this is just a booby prize. It doesn't help you grow. It really doesn't help you move things forward. It doesn't help you make a difference in your clients' lives. It doesn't help you make a difference in your family life. The only thing that matters is you making some kind of change that will be impactful to other people. Now with that, I'm going to take a breath and see if Mr. Wells has any questions for us or any feedback for us.
Thanks, Steve. Just a reminder, if you have any questions, you can do that in a couple of methods. You can type your question into the chat box. If you'd like that question to remain anonymous, please indicate so in your message. You can also click the hand icon on your GoToWebinar dashboard, and we'll call on you and unmute you so that you can be heard by everyone. Right now, we've had just one question. Someone wanted to make sure we're recording today's session, and we are. A member of our team will reach out to you to offer you the recording and help answer any questions about today's topic for you and see if they can help you in any way. One question I have heard before, Steve, when it comes to initial consultations is whether or not it has to be an attorney who should do the initial consultation, or if another member of your team can handle this for you. Can you talk just maybe a couple moments about that?
I'd love to, Mike. It's one of my favorite topics, and it's usually the one that at certain bar associations, if I start talking about non-lawyers doing initials, I get threatened to being burned at the stake for being a witch. So you have to think about this. If you can teach a non-lawyer to do initial meetings if you have your pricing down, if you've got your process down, if you can have your engagement letters down, and by down I mean in writing. And really, if the initial meeting is about setting expectations and explaining the process, you can completely have a non-lawyer do that. The only thing you really need a lawyer for is either evaluating the case or giving legal advice. In most cases, excuse me, let me rephrase that. In most law firms, the intake of the case occurs because someone has already pre-qualified that lead prior to coming into the meeting. So if it's a PI case, there's a high probability that the person that took the phone call has already pre-qualified that case, found out what the liability is like, what the damage is like, what's the coverage like, and you can actually have a non-lawyer, there's quite a few large PI firms that have non-lawyers do initial meetings. Quite a few estate planning firms, quite a few immigration firms, quite a few elder law firms have non-lawyers to initial meetings. I think it's only possible in a practice where the lawyer understands their process, understands their pricing, and has trained someone. I wouldn't take some poor paralegal or legal assistant and say, hey, guess what, you're doing initial this afternoon. There's a lot of strategy and work on that. In our upper level programs, Mike, I typically will recommend that someone's in the program for a year to 2 years before they go to that process. Some of the lawyers that coach with us will go 24 to 36 months of cleaning up the messes in their firm, tightening up the processes in the firm before they go to non-lawyers initial. So it's not something that I see happening very quickly in most firms, but it's something that a lot of lawyers, once they initiate and start, never ever want to quit doing because it's so darn effective. So it's a great question. Thank you, Mike.
All right. There have been no other questions that have been typed in or hands raised, so we'll end today's session at this time. Thank you, Steve, for presenting on this topic, and thank you to everybody who came.
Thank you, everyone. Have a great day. Bye.